This audio talk is titled Relaxing Our Grip on the Self. So tonight I want to talk about the role of self and how getting caught up in the idea of a self can actually create suffering and take us out of the present moment. As we move through this talk, hopefully the implicit distinction I'm making here between not self and no self will become explicitly clearer. So bear with me, if you will, while we unpack this. I'd like to begin with a discussion of the default mind states. Some of you may remember these 4 states of mind from our discussion in mindfulness-based stress reduction. So just to review, neuroscience research has discovered a network of brain activity that is referred to as the default mode network. Kelly McGonigal, who's a health psychologist at Stanford, and her colleagues have looked at this network in relation to the experience of human beings and the thinking mind. And what their research has discovered is that when human beings finish tasks and are ready to relax, the mind actually gets incredibly busy. You probably know exactly what I'm referring to here. I'm certain that all of us have had times where we just want to chill out. We just want to relax. We're done thinking, we're done working, we're tired, and yet the mind is going a mile a minute, thinking about lots of things that we may not even be interested in thinking about. And no matter who we are, for all of us, the mind tends to begin this wandering process in one of 4 states. And tonight I want to focus on 2 of these states specifically, but before we hone in on these 2, I'll give a quick overview of what the 4 default mind states are. So the 4 states include, the first one is commentary on the present moment experience. So instead of simply being present with all of the sensory activity of the moment, the smells, the sounds, the sights, the body sensations, the thinking mind actually tends to begin to comment on the present moment, which then dampens the experience of the present moment a little bit. And in addition to this commenting, there is also the process of deciding how the moment can be better. So you're sitting outside, you're feeling the breeze, you're hearing the birds, you're looking at the sky, you're possibly watching your grandchild play. And next thing, the mind, you notice, you get this thought of, I wish it were just a little warmer. Wouldn't it be nice if it were just a little warmer? Which this commentary on the present moment and coming up with ways to make it better actually also often devolves into a self-referential process in its own right. But we'll get back to this. The second default mind state is one of time travel. So here, instead of resting in the present moment, the thinking mind begins to dwell in experiences of the past or projects itself into the future, typically either worrying or planning. And ironically, this default mind state has a big component of I in it as well, because usually the focus of worry or planning, for example, is about the self to some extent. So those are the 2 default mind states we're actually not going to focus on tonight. So let's turn now to the 2 default mind states that we are going to look at with more depth in regard to this idea of working with self and how an emphasis on self can actually rob us of the larger present moment experience. So the third of the 4 default mind states has been referred to as self-referential processing. Essentially, the mind loves to think about me, mine and I. If I'm not thinking about me, I'm thinking about my spouse, my child, my fill in the blank. We could even retitle this mind state as the story of me. This is the territory of the million ways that the mind creates the concept of self. As we think, we become. As we narrate our lives, a sense of self comes into focus. Now, this is not to say that the sense of self does not develop through the numerous interactions we have with others, both closest to us and on the periphery. Of course it does. But it is what we do with these experiences experiences that become the basis of this sense of self. In many ways, this self develops out of all of the conscious and unconscious moments we spend thinking about the world in relation to me. So I want to just pause here for a moment and let you contemplate on how your mind becomes preoccupied with your own version of the story of me. What happens when you're lost in thought? So I'll just pause here for a moment. Take a moment. Often the story of me has aspects of likes and dislikes, approvals and disapprovals, judgments, ideas about the way we want life to be, ideas about the way others should act according to the way we see the world, etc. And all of this thinking and feeling about the self can become quite energy and time consuming. And a couple of things that occur as a result of this is that one, we can begin to have a sense of disconnection, not just from others and the larger world, but from the present moment itself. And two, we can become quite rigid in the ways that we see ourselves and the world when we don't hold this concept of self with some fluidity. The fourth of the default mind states has been referred to as social cognition. This state of mind includes all of the comparing that we do between self and the rest of the world, as well as between self and the idealized image that we hold of who or what the self should be. So instead of being with others in the fullness of whatever moment we're in, we tend to begin the running commentary of comparison, constantly wondering whether we measure up or not, evaluating this based usually on a fairly unconscious, rigid adherence to a particular sense of ourselves. I think it is fairly evident with this state of mind to see just how limiting and disconnecting it can be from a deeper experience of others and of the present moment. I want to quote Gil Fronsdal, who is a teacher with the Insight Meditation Center. And Gil says, "Here in the modern West, we have our own notions of what the self is or what it needs to be. In part, these are the legacy of Western ideas of soul, and in part they derive from the strong human drive to identify with certain things as defining what the self is. We identify ourselves with our thoughts, feelings, consciousness, volition, personal characteristics, or with a sense of continuity. Held lightly and provisionally, such identifications may be useful. Held tightly, they are self-limiting. If we expand the energy to cling to anything as the definition of the self, we will sooner or later suffer. In order to find a deeply abiding peace, we need to learn to let go of any attachment to or habit of fixating on self-identity." Certainly in the West, we have spent a lifetime consolidating the self. For those of us in the helping professions, we have countless theories about how identity develops. We spend time talking and working on, quote, self-esteem, and working on identifying characteristics that make up ourself. And so here we are now, considering that it is actually through the disillusion of self that we can find the most freedom. But what do I really mean by this? I recently sat on retreat with Donald Rothberg, who is a teacher at Spirit Rock Retreat Center in California. And Donald talked about the thick self and the need to thin the self. And contrary to what this actually might sound like, this was not a weight loss retreat. The idea of the thick self can be recognized as any preoccupation in any moment with what the self wants, or what the self needs, or what the self likes, or what the self decides is right or wrong. And in no way do I want to suggest that working in this way is equated with abandoning taking care of oneself. But I actually think we can learn to care for oneself deeply without becoming so fixated on a rigid sense of who we are. And this strikes at the difference between not self and no self. Of course, we all have a self, and we have idiosyncrasies that create difference between self and other. We have boundaries that we nurture and protect. We have skin and bones and muscles that create this frame that allow us to walk around and interact with others and the world at large. But the thinking mind gets carried away with an importance of focusing almost obsessively on the self. And this comes in many forms, of course. For some people, it's a very negative self-talk that happens. For others, it is a talk of superiority. And then there are all the variations in between. No matter what form it takes, it certainly takes us out of experiencing the connection with the vast wonder of life. As the 14th Dalai Lama often says, everyone wants to be happy. No one wants to suffer. This is one of the core binding inner experiences we have. The preoccupation with me produces separateness. This separateness leads to more preoccupation, and the cycle continues. So this week, as we continue our meditation practice in choiceless awareness, and we begin to deepen our consciousness around connecting with the present moment and all that's in the present moment, I invite you to begin to bring a level of consciousness to where you get caught up in the story of the self, the story of me. And when you notice this preoccupation or being distracted and carried away by these kinds of thoughts, just see if you can pause, take a breath, expand out again to experience all that can be experienced. I look forward to talking about it when we come back together. Be well.